Okay, well, it's a great delight to be back here again. I was here 9 years ago after a meeting in Barcelona, and it's good to be back with this vibrant group. I hope that you will be able to understand my English better than I could understand Elias's Spanish. So I thought for a diverse audience that it would be good to give a broad sweep of the evolution of farming systems in Australia. It's especially interesting because it gives insights into how innovation happens. To give you a little background on Australia first, I'll be talking about our dryland cropping areas, which you can see as brown on this map, but you have to, in our environment, turn the map upside down to compare it with yours. And most of the cropping areas are in latitudes that run from Cordova, which is equivalent to this, to Marrakesh, which is equivalent to about here. So we are in a much lower latitude than most of the cropping in your part of the world. The cropping is wheat and barley, etc., are grown during the winter time, as you have here, from autumn to late spring, but the distribution of rainfall is much more uniform throughout the year, and that has important consequences. And these little graphs here show the distribution of rainfall from January to December at various places. And what have I done? There's nothing on my screen here.
Actually, is the only one that knows how to manage this thing. Oh.
Well, I'll try something new.
Try escape.
No, it's still there.
No, it's the machine.
No, it's the machine.
Oh.
And this is the first time.
Does the first words...
Do you have a remote control?
No, we don't. But I can disconnect and connect again, which is the way you saw 1990.
Does the first word say goodbye?
Apago la cosa. Let me turn off.
No, that's to turn it off. No, you don't want to do that.
Ah. Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
Go ahead. Until next.
So this is the grand sweep of wheat yields in Australia over 150 years. And it's quite a remarkable graph because there were three main jumps in yield separated by plateaus where nothing happened. In the first stage, you can think of this as organic farming, in that there were no inputs, and we were heading for a catastrophe here. Now, the similarity between the jumps is that they represented sudden changes in farming system that relied on several different aspects of management and genetics coming together simultaneously, and then you get a different change. And they tend to be precipitated by great difficulty or by great opportunity. Now, here, this was just heading for zero, and there was also a very big drought here. And at this time, superphosphates started to become available, and new varieties became available that flowered in early spring rather than late spring, which was the European varieties that were imported, and of course they had very little chance of yielding well if you flower at what is now the harvest time. So then that was flat for a while, but at this point three or four things came together. One was that the price of wool increased enormously, and this I meant to emphasize is a mixed farming system where you have animals and crops and you alternate between pastures and cropping. The Korean War increased the price of wool by several fold, so the farmers wanted to grow as much as possible. So they used subclover pastures seriously for the first time, even though the clover, the leguminous pasture species, had been available for a long time. The result of that was that when they went from pasture to cropping, there was much more nitrogen in the soil. And that is essentially what led to this increase here. And then there was another plateau. And I will spend some time talking about that very steep rise later. And then in the last decade, we had 8 years of very bad drought, which you can see there, but now it's taking off again, and I will cover those too. So I want to concentrate now on what was happening. Why was there no improvement at all during that time? And the group that I work with essentially works in the vicinity of Canberra there, and they were predominantly instrumental in bringing about that steep rise from the mid-1980s on. So we had, until about the mid-1980s, kept telling ourselves that Australian crops were limited by water. And then people started plotting yield against water supply, and in this quite productive area, if you look at the average yields for the district, there was no response to water. And this caused great shock amongst the agronomic community because we had never believed this before. Only at very low water supplies did you have an effect. So that shock resulted in some rethinking, and you see that that flat period was associated with that complete absence of response to the seasonal rainfall. So the rethinking was stimulated by agronomists who started plotting not through time or average over a district, but individual farms and experiments, and demonstrated what the crop physiologists had been aware of but hadn't made it through to agronomy, that there is a maximum yield that you can get for a given amount of water, which is this boundary line here. You never get anything up about there. And the farmers became aware of this. They started to think in terms of the amount of water, amount of yield per millimetre of water that they got. And they were motivated very quickly, within a few years, to try to increase their yields up towards this line. The intercept on this axis is most easily interpreted as the evaporation of water directly from the soil, which in a Mediterranean environment is quite large, especially during establishment when the soil is wet but the leaves are not very large. So the crop physiologists started wondering about how to move this line, and the molecular biological revolution started trying to get points into this corner of the graph. Without much discussion with physiologists, and there are 1,000 papers about in which you can, if you search for drought resistance, plant breeding and transformation, you get about 1,000 papers, but they're all concerned with survival rather than production. And it's easy to use survival as a screen, but it doesn't help very much. But the farmers were trying to increase yield this way. If you're a crop physiologist, however, a better way of looking at it is that this is a good crop, and this is a poor crop, maybe not enough nitrogen, something like that. The slope of the line at low nitrogen and high nitrogen is the same. The difference between the two is in the amount of water that you lose by direct evaporation from the soil, because you don't have the leaf area there to make use of that water. So this relationships between yield and water are not peculiar to Australia, and Victor Sadras, whom many of you may know or be familiar with, who is a genius at extracting data from the literature, with my colleague John Angus, produced this graph of 700 experiments in 4 major environments, and you see everybody has points occupying that triangle in there, and not many of them are on that bounding line, which shows the maximum water use efficiency. The North American Great Plains, the green ones, look to be particularly bad, but in their defense, their environment is such that they can have catastrophic failure of flowering because of sudden hot, dry weather, and it's very difficult to deal with that. But it's remarkable that the bounding line is so sharp. So this analysis of water economy of the plant has now settled down to a framework of this sort, which is in the minds of our agronomists and indeed of the farmers now, in which you think, what is your water supply? How can I increase it? You've got the precipitation during the season. You've got the amount of water in the soil at the time of sowing, which you can manipulate a little. Water not extracted by the crop, and losses due to runoff and evaporation from the soil. That leaves you with the water that goes through the plant, which is productive, and the transpiration efficiency for the production of dry matter in our environment, and I expect in yours, is about 55 kilograms per hectare millimetre, depending on the average VPD during the season and so on. It could be 50 to 60. That gives you the biomass that you can expect. In an environment in which you are maturing into increasingly hot and dry environment, a harvest index of 0.4 is reasonably achievable. the harvest indices of 0.5, 0.55 that you can get in France and England and other parts of humid Europe are not achievable usually. And that 0.4 multiplied by 55 gives you 22 kilograms per hectare for every millimetre. So these are manageable components of the water economy that the agronomists and farmers can think about. Because we have some summer rainfall, you can capture that in the subsoil. You can't stop the water evaporating from the surface of the soil, but if you get rid of all of the weeds, you will prevent weeds removing water from the subsoil. And leaving a mulch on the surface can help. The previous crop can influence things. And if you are trying to capture summer rainfall, you need to sow much earlier than we used to. So I will come back to some of these things later. So back to this one. Why were there no responses to growing season rainfall during that time? Well, the shorter answer is that the farmers were aiming for 2 tonnes of yield, and they got 2 tonnes of yield on average. Why? Well, farmers are dominated in their thinking by risk management. You don't aim for the highest possible yield, you aim for a reasonably attainable yield, because if you aim for the highest possible yield, the chances are that you will lose the money on the fertilizer that you put on, and sometimes the yield can be even less. The yield can be even less because in this type of environment, if you use too much water before flowering because you have too many leaves, there is not enough left for grain filling, and that means you have a very low harvest index. So in that period where I told you that there was leguminous pasture rich in nitrogen, they found that if they put extra nitrogen on, the crops would often fail, so they stopped. They didn't, this was just empirical, had no idea of why the crops were failing so much, but they succeeded with their risk management. Although we've separated risk management from agronomic management there, it's really part of the same thing. So this is I'm talking about this period with the black ellipse around it now, in which the yield doubled in the area where our agronomists were working. So we've got the change of idea about water economy that I've just described to you. And one of the other factors that had a big influence, so 3 factors came together. There was the change in how you think about water. There was the introduction of a wonderful break crop, canola, which had not been possible before because of disease problems, which had then been solved. And also there was the uptake of no-till farming, general conservation agriculture. So the introduction of canola soon led farmers to realize that the yield of wheat was 10 to 20% higher after canola than after anything else. And the agronomists started thinking about this and realized that there had been severe root diseases, unrecognized, in that flat period where nothing had happened for some time and the farmers were aiming for 2 tonnes. So the reason that the crops were failing if they tried to go for higher yields was that the roots were shallow because they were affected by root disease. If you get good even rainfall through the year, that won't matter. But if you get good water in the subsoil and you can't get at it, then you'll get failure. So the sequence of events, once root diseases were recognised, was that canola, plus herbicides for removing grasses during the summer fallow, which carried over the diseases of the wheat, gave less root disease, which gave a more reliable response to nitrogen. So the farmers started using nitrogen with confidence and aiming for higher yields, and the yields in that area now are 5 to 6 tonnes instead of the 2 that the farmers were aiming at before. This is not to say that the productivity increased so dramatically, because the inputs are higher. Nevertheless, if there are economists among you, the total factor productivity was increasing 3 or 4% per year during this period, which is a lot. I mentioned that the third innovation at this time, which came together to bring about the change in farming system, was conservation farming, mechanical soil disturbance, permanent soil cover, and diverse crop species. And there was a rapid adoption over a period of about 10 years, so that the proportion of arable land, it's now more like 80% in Australia. And Europe is 0.4, Africa 0.1 of the percent of arable land. And this shows you the rapid adoption from about 1990 in Australia, which led to other problems with herbicide resistance, which is something that we have to keep tackling all the time. So this buoyant period came to a sharp end when we had 8 years of very severe drought. And in this graph, the blue lines show the actual average Australian yield, and there were some catastrophes during this time. But it was not only the reduced annual rainfall. A problem just as big was that the sowing rains in autumn were much reduced, and farmers had trouble getting their crop in at all, even if following conditions were good. So I'll talk a bit about that period. So what do the farmers do when they're faced with something like this? They try to think of something new. The summer rainfall was still reasonable, so they decided, together with the agronomists, to capture that rainfall. And they have to adapt quite strongly to do that. So the management style became from, you could think of as going from strategic, which is a sort of recipe that you applied each year, to tactical. You respond to the season as it is happening. And you can do that only if you already have a wide range of options that you can choose between. Because if you only have the options for the standard procedure, then you can't change. So you need new varieties, you need new agronomy. And they had different varieties because farming had started to go from a crop, wheat growing and canola growing had started to move from the semi-arid areas into the higher rainfall zone. And that required slower maturing varieties that could be planted earlier. So this is what actually happened during that time. And it led to what I think will be the next jump in yield on that graph that I've shown you of yield through time, because the adaptations that the farmers and agronomists made during that time are here forever, even if we go back to seasons as we used to know them, because they're more productive. So one of the things that they did was to use very good weed control to get as much of the summer rain into the subsoil. Now, this rain is evaporating from the surface all the time, so the drying front is going down slowly. So you have to sow early to catch it before it disappears. So they decided to try sowing the seeds dry. Now, the farmers will be sowing 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 hectare. They have machines that are sowing 20 metres wide and moving 10 kilometres at an hour. But if they wait until the chance of sowing rain, which might enable a window of 1 week, even with these big machines, they can only sow a third of the farm. Whereas if they sow dry, they can sow carefully, slowly, the whole farm. And when the rain comes, they will germinate reasonably well. But it's interesting that the farmers were very unconfident about using this, as you can imagine, because you're putting all of your resources into sowing something which might never come up. But the crop physiologists mobilized old data and made particularly good use of Kent Bradford's work from Davis, who had worked on what happens during germination. Because the farmers were worried that if they got a small fall of rain, the seeds would start to germinate and then die if there was no more rain. But Kent had shown that in the first stage of germination, before a coleoptile appears, the seed is very tough, and the biochemistry is initiated, the enzymes are put in place, and they stay there. So if you get another fall if it dries out, the seeds go to sleep, and another fall of rain, they take off immediately because the biochemistry has already been put into place. And this, we went around talking to farmers and farm advisors, discussing the crop physiology behind this, and they were given the confidence to try it, and they did. Other innovations were to make use of dual-purpose crops, that is, wheat that could be grazed before it started stem elongation, and canola which could be grazed. This is, was in the background in many countries, I think, have tried this sort of thing, but it really took off. These innovations were enabled by having several years of conservation tillage, which made the soil soft enough to be able to sow into it dry, even though the soil is harder than it would be with ploughing. The mobilization of existing knowledge, as I described to you about putting dry seed into the ground, and the wide range of genotypes available, so that there were long season genotypes that could be sown early to catch the water in the subsoil, yet flower at the right time, because the most important factor in yield is that the wheat plants flower at the right time, at a minimum risk between damage by frost, if the flowering is too early, and damage by heat and drought, if the flowering is too late. So the overall conclusion in relation to innovation is that novel genotypes and novel agronomy as a range of options for farmers to choose among enabled them to respond to that catastrophic period of 8 years and made them much more resilient. So here's an example of a dual purpose crop that I mentioned. Okay, and we were surprised to find that often, maybe in about 20% of years, the grain yield was actually higher on the grazed crop than on the ungrazed. So here we have the ungrazed, and here this was grazed until you could see nothing green, but before stem elongation. And that crop recovered to produce 2.8 tonnes, and the ungrazed produced 2.3. And we still don't fully understand what is happening, but the best hypothesis is that there is saving of a small amount of water in the subsoil for use during grain filling that can lead to that difference. And other experiments done for different reasons had shown that in an extra 10 millimetres of water during grain filling can lead to 500 kilograms per hectare extra yield, which is a phenomenal return, because any photosynthesis at that time is going straight to the grain without much loss in respiration. And just as importantly, that extra bit of water gives the plant more time. It keeps the plant going longer to retranslocate earlier photosynthate into the grain. This was the old system with grazing, burning, cultivating, and sowing in the middle of autumn, to the new, in which we have no-till, no general grazing, but except for the dual-purpose crops, very good weed control, rotation, and sowing 1 month earlier. But sowing early in chasing water in the subsoil, you need varieties that you can sow maybe 150 millimetres deep. The semi-dwarf wheats with the standard dwarfing genes in only grow coleoptiles that are 50 millimetres long. If you try to sow them at 150, you get nothing. So the breeders had been spending a lot of effort in trying to get alternative dwarfing genes, which give you a dwarf stem with the many advantages of that, together with a long coleoptile. And they had succeeded in doing that, but as a pre-breeding exercise, but the breeders have not adopted it, and I will explain why in a little while. But here is an example of what happens if you sow 1 month earlier, as an illustration of the effect that has on the evaporative loss from the soil. Same variety, sown 5 weeks earlier, and you've got a substantial leaf area index here and almost nothing there, because the soil is getting cold, the air is getting cold, and the water that has evaporated from this one has been put to productive use in that one. So this was a recipe developed about 6 years ago by 2 of my colleagues for seeing how they could make a new system that would be more productive. So you start with a baseline of the old system, which you would expect to get 1.6 tonnes per hectare. And then you try adding different components of a new farming system. So in this graph, this shows the yield that you would expect. This is predominantly a modelling exercise, but it has now been shown in practice. Modelling exercise 6 years ago. This is what happens if you do each of these by themselves. This is what happens if you do them accumulatively. So no-till gives you a slight increase in yield, partly because of your ability to be more timely in your sowing. The fallow weed control gives a substantial effect because you get the summer rainfall. The break crop, peas especially, because they do not take much water from the subsoil, give you more water to use. And the early sowing has a substantial effect. And the new genotypes with the long coleoptile reduce the yield. And that's why the breeders were not interested in them. Why does it reduce the yield? Because in a breeding the breeders put in 250,000 plots. This is a major logistical operation. And they put them all in the ground at the same time. So if you take a long coleoptile wheat and you sow it deeply, it will take a week longer to emerge than the semi-dwarfs, the normal semi-dwarfs, and therefore you get a reduced yield because the longer you delay sowing, the worse off you are. So you can only select for a novel genotype like that in the agronomy that it is intended for. And the breeders have not yet thought about, well, maybe they've thought about and rejected, trying to select their varieties in the current agronomy. And this will have to change. So the bottom line is that in the old farming system where you were getting 1.6 tonnes per hectare, in principle you can get 3 times that. That's another close-up picture of the long coleoptile genotype versus with different dwarfing genes compared with the normal dwarfing genes. Another thing that emerged was that you get a greater potential yield by using varieties that are slower maturing and which also have a longer period of stem elongation, because during that period is when you are forming your floral structures. And the yellow there gives you the time during which this variety is forming its floral structures. It's a long season variety that you sow early, compared with the one above, which has not much more than half of the same period for stem elongation. And the agronomists have, in separate experiments, have shown a pretty good correlation between the grain yield and the growth in dry matter between during the stem elongation period. So the new package is strict summer weed control. So to go back to the idea about managing the water economy of the plant, the thinking initially was, how can we make best use of the seasonal water supply. The new package asks the question, how can we make best use of the annual water supply? That is, we are looking at the summer rainfall as well as the winter rainfall. The early sown, later maturing wheats have deeper roots. They can extract, the roots are growing into warm soil for longer, and they go much deeper. And this has environmental implications because Australia is prone to having salinity problems, which are caused by the removal of natural vegetation which used water during the summertime, which the crops do not, and a few millimetres of drainage eventually accumulates and brings salt to the surface. To avoid the problem that the farmers in the 40s and 50s were managing by aiming for low yields, but so as not to have too much vegetative growth, the new package has wider row spacing so that the use of water during the vegetative period is kept under control a bit. And there's a much more subtle but very important effect that because you have done many of the important farm operations early in the year, you have more time to do other operations without feeling hurried during the rest of the year. So while you might think that that arrow going up to the question mark might have been wild optimism, we now believe that we can keep on track after the period of drought by going to this new farming system. And it's not only because of the modelling that's been done, but the models have been tested, and the Grains Research and Development Corporation in Australia, which is funded about 2/3 by a levy on the farmers, challenged the agronomists working with the farming groups, that is groups of farmers and their advisors, to increase the water use efficiency by 10% over the whole of Australia, average. And the work that has been done over 5 years, this is a 5-year project, has resulted in 25% increase in water use efficiency by going to this new package. And that is now being rapidly adopted by farmers. The 25% is partly on farm, partly in research plots, but it's going to be much more than 10%. And that leads me to a discussion of how innovation happens, at least in our part of the agricultural world. I think most of the innovation starts through conversations between the agronomists and the farmers. The agronomists can come up with new ideas, new options, new opportunities, new concepts like the water balance idea or the water economy idea, but the farmers can see emerging problems. They have operational constraints. It might be related to the market, it might be price of canola versus wheat, something like this, which the agronomists are usually not aware of. And the good ones are very good observers, and they also invent things by themselves. And the way that the Grains and Research and Development Corporation works is that it wholesales information, mostly. Because the extension system in Australia, the government extension system, collapsed about 20 years ago. And the best of the government employees became private consultants, and 80% of the crop is advised by these consultants. Now, if you talk to a farmer, they will give you very good insights into their own farm, but what they're talking about might be specific to their own farm. But a consultant has 30 farmers, and they get an overview of emerging problems and emerging opportunities. So the dialogue between the research agronomists and the consultants is extremely valuable. Now, one can also, if there are physiologists or molecular biologists among you, fill in boxes like these, top and bottom, for each of these transitions also. So the molecular biologist can go directly to the breeders, and marker-assisted breeding is of enormous use at the moment because of empirical relations between things that are difficult to select for, but which you have good markers for. And some of the root diseases are a good example of that. You can go straight there. But I mentioned to you earlier that there are 1,000 useless papers looking for drought resistance in molecular biology because this arrow here stops short and goes back. So 99% of those papers, the scientists have not asked a physiologist or an agronomist anything about productivity. They assume that survival is going to be drought resistance, and therefore we will get big yields without water. That is now changed, fortunately, and an even more spectacular example of that is in the search for salt tolerance, where there are several hundred papers in which you take Arabidopsis, you put it in seawater, and you get wonderful gene expression. Why? Because when you put the roots in seawater, they plasmolyze. That is, the plasma membrane is ripped off the cell wall as the water is extracted by the seawater because of the osmotic effect. And this leads to wonderful gene expression. The physiologists get to seawater by slowly increasing over 4 increments towards there, and there is no plasmolysis. Tried to convince the molecular biologists about this. The molecular biologists tried, but didn't like it because there wasn't any good gene expression. So those conversations across scale are crucially important for leading to innovation. If you don't understand the constraints and different things that might happen in a good context at a higher level of organization in the plant, then you are doomed to just do nonsensical experiments. And what else can I say? This goes on, of course, out here because the farmers need advice on economics and marketing and so on. So I see that the challenge to us as agricultural scientists is to arrange ourselves in such a way that these conversations across the whole scale happen automatically without having to be self-conscious about it. But it's difficult to go more than one scale at a time. A molecular biologist can talk to a breeder, but a molecular biologist cannot talk to an agronomist. It has to be via a physiologist because it's a different language. You don't have the same terms in common. And that brings me to the end.
only from students. You ask me, so you should ask me.
You're trying very hard, but nothing is coming out, huh?
Let me ask you to start. If anybody has a pressing question, I'll start. We have a dominant crop in this area, which is olive. You have what I call a dominant crop, which is wheat. You have a system that you mentioned, the Grains the Research and Development Council. And apparently you mentioned that it's mostly funded by growers. Can you explain a little bit how that operates, and could that be a model for research and development in olive production here?
The farmers pay 1% of their gross income into a fund, which is about 65% of the research and development funds that are available through the Grains R&D Corporation. The other is from the government. So this is a semi-government organisation, but it has a board which oversees its operation, which comprises farmers and business people and so on. And the strategic thought going into what should be researched is done by 3 panels of 10 people, one for Northern Australia, one for Southeastern Australia, and one for Southwestern Australia. And each of those panels has 5 farmers and 5 others. There will be 3 scientists perhaps, 1 marketer, 1 economist. And they have very good strategic discussions. So the scientists can get together and say, this is a great idea. I'll give you an example from my own experience, because I worked on one of these panels for 6 years. White lupins fetch a very high price during a certain time of the year for a religious festival. And the farmers and the agronomists became excited about growing white lupins until one of the economists said, you know that there is only 40,000 tonnes market during this period of high prices, and if you make it 100,000 tonnes, the price will do this. So you get what I've come to think of as reality therapy. So let me go back to that. These arrows are providing reality therapy to the people working in more detailed areas, and reality therapy is enormously important. So these panels generate a strategic research area that they would think that there are good opportunities in, or that there are emerging problems that they think they have to deal with. And then there is a call each year for projects to go into this area. And that works best when you have already developed dialogue between panel members and the scientists involved. And you start to develop good networks and mutual trust. And the presence of the farmers always ensures that the work, there are some exceptions, generally ensures that the work has relevance to their farming operations. The main area of failure, which might be 20% of the budget, is that the scientists can easily be enthused by new techniques, like the molecular biology revolution, or the current one, which is the phenotyping genomics revolution. which may follow the same course as the molecular biology one. That is 20 years of no progress, and then it will start to be useful. So where was it? So the farmers can get excited about the novelty of the future, and I think the Grains R&D Corporation has wasted about 10 to 20% of its funds on the future promise. And I remember meeting an ecologist in Italy a couple of years ago, where I was teaching a course in Sardinia, and he said he used to be a molecular biologist. I said, oh, that's a big change from molecular biology to ecology. And he said, I got sick of escaping to the future. So, genomics, forget about that. Proteomics, this is okay. No, forget about that. Metabolomics, this is where we are. Forget it. So, there's been a sequence of great promise and then no promise as we move through this. This is not to say that the advances have been tremendous, and empirically they have been tremendous. Well, another aside, the use of genome-wide selection has been extraordinary. Where you have good phenotyping behaviour, you can take a whole genome and you look for a pattern in it which corresponds to the behaviour of what you're interested in. And this was developed for dairy cows, where every cow in a good farm has its milk production measured every day, and the progeny tables are well known. They know who the mother and father of all of these through, and they've matched a pattern which they can't describe, they just can recognise it, with the genome of the cow, and they can select cows for better production, and the rate of increase of genetic gain has doubled during that time. Applying that to a variable dryland environment is another matter, of course. The phenomics are not the same, but it's working with sheep in a less ideal. So that was a bit of a diversion from how the Grains Research and Development Corporation operates, and how they can, every now and then they get excited about something called blue sky research, which is what I've just described, the far future. And they get excited about overseas collaboration. So we try to tell them that every project should have overseas collaboration all the time. So what's the excitement? So, but overall it has worked spectacularly well. And this most recent project, it was a $20 million project over 5 years, will increase the yield by 20%. And the total factor productivity, I think, will go up substantially, because unlike the increase in yield after that long plateau, where the increase was due to greater inputs, I don't think there will be so much greater inputs with this new one, other than more water, because of capturing the summer rain, and more genotypic opportunity to develop higher potential grain yields. You have to match it with nitrogen, of course, but I think it will go better. So, a long answer, but that's how it operates, and I don't know what this is. There's a lot of politics behind this, of course, the setting up of these organisations.
How old is the system?
The system dates from about 1990, and there are 4 or 5 of these organisations, animals, horticulture, so on. But the grains one is the one that has been most successful, because of the internal organisation of having panels, including half farmers and half others.
Good afternoon. You said before that in April you have in the subsoil water level, okay, that is going deeper and deeper day after day. So in May you can't plant because of the root length. Is it so difficult to find a new genotype of this kind of plant which has a higher root to reach that water?
Yes. Let me give a bit more background. The rate of evaporation decreases with the square root of time. So if you lose so much water in 1 week, you will lose the same amount of water in 4 weeks and the same amount again in 16 weeks. So it disappears fast to start off with and then slowly, so you can then capture it. But if you wait until May, you will never catch it unless you have good rains that make a connection between the seed and the water down there. The roots, the seed can germinate at the, Elias and I were talking about permanent wilting point earlier, can germinate at permanent wilting point. About half the rate at which they can in wet soil, but they will germinate. And the roots will grow, even. So providing they can find a space through the soil, they will keep on going. But to find genotypic variation in that is extremely difficult.
Thank you very much.
Okay.